all of a sudden the Pentagon just started shaking and vibrating, and there was a loud sound. One of our civilian secretaries, she kind of got up and said, "A bomb went off, a bomb went off." As she glanced up as the building was shaking, looked at the hallway and saw what appeared to be a flash of flame whooshed in front of her.
Today on Bets and Badges, we're going to discuss American Airlines Flight 77 crashing into the U.S. Pentagon. I am Robert Asencio. Next to me is my host and colleague, retired police chief David Magnuson, who is also a military historian. How are you, David?
Doing great.
We have the pleasure of speaking with Mike Hogan, who is serving in the Pentagon as a lieutenant colonel for the U.S. Army. He was the Army's congressional liaison. Yeah. So let's get right into it, Mike. Tell us about September 11th, shortly after 9:37 a.m., when this plane strikes the Pentagon.
It was the first day of our new boss's tenure. So job that morning was to brief the new guy on what it is that we did. And as the briefing was going on, we had TVs scattered throughout the office space. I looked over and I could see 3 or 4 co-workers that were kind of gathered under one of the TVs. I went over to the TV to ask the folks that were sitting there watching the TV what they were watching. And one of them said a second plane had just flown into the World Trade Center. And at that point, I said, "What?" And they said, "It looks like a second plane has flown into the World Trade Center." And right about then, all of a sudden, the Pentagon just started shaking and vibrating, and just kind of it was as if there was a loud sound kind of being muffled a little bit, and it just shook. The ceiling tiles shook. Dust came down from the ceilings, and everybody kind of looked at each other, not quite sure what it was. One of our civilian secretaries, who had her desk faced one of the hallways that passes from the outer E-ring into the interior of the Pentagon, the A-ring, and she kind of got up and paused for a second and then started going out the back door in a very quick manner and said, "A bomb went off, a bomb went off." And it appeared that she, as she glanced up as the building was shaking, looked at the hallway and saw what appeared to be a flash of flame that just whooshed down the corridor in front of her. And again, wow. she thought it was a bomb. At that point, nobody was sure that it was a plane that came in. We just what we were sure of is the building shook, and if you were in the right spot and you could see out into the corridor, it appeared that there was flames that were actually going down the corridor.
Did the flames come towards your section?
As we learned later, American Airlines Flight 77, that was a Boeing 757. So it was a plane, designed to fly coast to coast, longer routes, had departed Dulles about an hour before it turned around and appeared to circle in the DC area, whether it circled the Pentagon or whether it circled, DC, and then kind of aligned itself onto the Pentagon and just flew. What the reports said later was, it lined up the target and basically got as low as it could get and cranked up the speed to 550 miles an hour. And was low to the ground, supposedly was, actually knocking down some of the light posts and stuff as it was coming uh, towards the Pentagon, and then, smashed into either the first or second floor of that portion of the building. So, whether that was the intended target, whether that spot was just a randomly picked out that morning, not sure.
The reason why I ask is because I know you felt the concussion. I wondered if you felt the heat, because there was a lot of fuel in that plane. Like I said in the opening, it was over 7,000 gallons of fuel.
We did not feel the heat. So basically, we felt the building shake. Just to describe the Pentagon a little bit, again, it's a large enough building to, house almost 30,000 workers. It's basically divided into 5 separate buildings. So, you have a 5-sided building, and the outer ring, the E ring, is more or less a standalone building. And then there's a space of probably 50 feet between the E ring and the D ring. And the D ring, again, is a standalone building on the inside of the E ring. And then you've got the C ring, and then you've got the B ring, and then you've got the most interior part of the building is the A ring, which is, the smallest, ring within the building. My office was in the C ring. So where the plane impacted the building, it hit into the E ring, the outer ring of the building, and went through the E ring, went through the D ring, and hit the C ring. So what we actually felt in my office is we felt the last nudge of the plane hitting, our ring of that. The flames as the plane exploded, with not quite a full fuel tanks, but almost full. Again, it was loaded up for a coast to coast flight, and had only been in the air for less than an hour. So it still was pretty heavily loaded with fuel. The fuel, once it exploded on impact, was looking for avenues to escape down. And basically what it did was, they went down the aisles, the corridors, the hallways of the building. And that's where flames basically, were routed through. But again,
and that's when you saw your secretary saw the flash of flames coming down the corridor, right?
So it was a whoosh, 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 and again, it took her brain a few seconds to kind of try to figure out what she was looking at. And again, the best thing that she could think is, it looked like a bomb going off.
And I'm sure you guys question, like, what the hell is she saying? I mean, that doesn't happen here.
The Pentagon, generally is, tracking current events. We got a good number of the people who worked in the Pentagon at the time, had access to TVs. They were, so they were aware of what was happening in New York. But I'm not sure that many people within the Pentagon would have immediately jumped to the conclusion of, we just got hit by a plane.
The weather was gorgeous. Beautiful day, right? What's your thoughts? That had to have aided in the New York for sure, and certainly in picking out the Pentagon after circling, that you had clear visibility.
Line of sight.
Line of sight, yeah.
And I didn't realize that until I got out of the building. I mean, because, when I was driving into work, it was dark. So after the plane flew into the building, once we started evacuating the building, by the time I was outside of the Pentagon, and, I looked back and I could see the smoke rising over the Pentagon, the first thing that struck my mind was how gorgeous a day it was. And there were no clouds in the sky. It was a bright blue, sunny day, great, nice, cool morning. And, again, you think from the terrorist standpoint, I mean, they couldn't have asked for better weather for inexperienced pilots to be able to find a target and fly the planes into their targets. There was a security camera that was pointing towards the impact site and actually caught a image of the plane right before the plane went into the building.
Can you describe the conditions that followed right after this plane strikes the building?
As the building shook, as the tiles shook, as the dust fell, as we looked at each other, looked at fellow workers and tried to process what we think just happened. Then something that I had never heard, and at that point I had worked in the Pentagon for over 2 years, and all of a sudden, this loudspeaker system came on and started directing people to exit the building in an orderly fashion. And it was one of those things that it sounded to me like it was a pre-recorded message of, sirens were kind of blaring, the emergency lights, were flashing, and this voice was going, exit the buildings in an orderly fashion. So as people, again, we're starting to digest what they think happened, we started moving out into the hallway, and the hallways by now were crowded with hundreds, if not thousands, of folks that were going down each of the corridors and stuff. And then the corridor that was closest to my office, at the end of the corridor on the E-ring to get out of the building, there was a whole bank of doors that were not generally manned. It was not an entrance or an exit that was typically used. So they had, these signs on the door of do not open, use only in an emergency type of thing. And all of a sudden this large crowd just came to a stop. It's like they got to the doors. Nobody had seen these doors actually be used, and they weren't quite sure if this was an emergency warranting to actually open these doors. So as the crowd was kind of moving at its own inertia and then all of a sudden the first group gets to the door, the crowd just comes to a stop. And one brave soul decided he would take matters into his own hand and said, yeah, if this ain't an emergency that we can open the door, damn sure seems like it, and kicked the doors open. And once they opened the doors, then people started exiting the building. As we came out the door, out of the E-ring, if you turn to the left, that was where the plane had actually gone into the building. So there were some folks, as they started walking, then they could see the smoke, they could see whatever flames at that point, and would then go into the building and try to help in any way that they could. And then others were being told generally, if you have a crisis like this, each staff element would want to get all of their people out of the building and then have an accountability formation. Mm-hmm. Let's get track of, who we've got. I mean, how many folks from our section or our office are out here and accounted for. So that's where people were doing that type of thing as well.
On that flight, I know there was you tell the story of a bunch of children that were heading out to California as part of a contest winning type of thing. Can you about that a little bit?
Well, there were some elementary school kids who had won a prize, and their prize in the competition that they had competed in to take a flight, which, for most of them, this was the first time they had ever been on a plane. And they were going to fly them to Los Angeles. So it was that group of kids was part of the 64 casualties. There were some younger children that were with their family members, with their parents, that were actually, also, traveling to Los Angeles, that were victims as well. Within the Pentagon, there was a total of 125 that were killed, in the attack.
Amidst those that were killed, you tell the story of a gentleman named Max.
Within the Army, the senior ranking person that was killed from the Pentagon was a 3-star general, Army General Timothy Maude. And General Maude was the G1. He was kind of the human resources, the personnel person in charge of, personnel issues for the Army. And, the story is that, he was having a meeting in his office, and they had just moved into their new office, into this newly renovated wedge, and just days before 9/11 had moved into this office space and had a window that looked out on the E-ring. And probably for those that were in the meeting, that I had heard it was a meeting that of at least 13 people, and you got to think that a good number of them at some point glanced at the window and could see the plane heading right for them. And in many cases, it required DNA analysis to identify the casualties, later on as recovery efforts and as first responders were going through and recovering what they could, that many of the casualties that were right there closest to the impact of the plane, were not complete bodies at that point. So one of the last persons that was identified was a retired Master Sergeant, Max Belkey, who had worked within the retirement services division of the personnel office. And his kind of an interesting fact with him is he was in Vietnam and was evacuated as the last combat soldier as we were pulling troops out of Vietnam. And he was the last one who got on the ramp of the planes and pulled out, and then becomes a casualty of 9/11.
Jeez. Talking about faith. To survive Vietnam and then be taken out by enemy of this country on 9/11. I suspect you saw quite a few individuals, fellow Americans, perform acts of heroism, nothing less than heroism on that day.
There were people who did very heroic actions to try to save whoever they could save. Sadly, there weren't that many. There weren't that many wounded in this case. I mean, it was like, the casualties. Most of the casualties were killed, and there were a lot that were burned to death. But there was a big effort to save whatever folks that they could.
I want to give a great deal of thanks for a very sobering, factual look into a tragedy that took place step by step behind the scenes.
So true.
I thank you for that, Mike.
Yeah, as a fellow American, as a former member of the Army, myself, as a Vets and Badges, I can't thank you enough, sir.
Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate what you're doing.
To the Millers, Grant, Michael Miller, Miami's Community News team, our producer behind the scene, Rachel Brummage. Again, we owe you immense debt of gratitude. Thank you. To you, the public, we hope this episode has been of importance to you. You can find us on at Vets and Badges on most podcast platforms. We urge you to consider looking us up. Check out some of our videos. This has been another episode of Vets and Badges. Thank you.